Okay, let's get started in another minute. So if you can take your seats. You know what? No, I will. I think just for efficiency's sake, I'll just say.
And will they pull up the slides?
Oh, yeah. Okay. No, you can't.
Okay.
So, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and go ahead with this session 2 of afternoon scientific session, interventions to mitigate non-adherence. Our first presenter is Dr. William Fitzsimmons of Astellas Pharma, and he's going to discuss pharmaceutical dosage forms to improve adherence.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. I want to express my appreciation to the FDA for organizing and leading this patient-focused drug development discussion on organ transplantation. I really believe this is a milestone in our field, an important one. And also thank all the patients who, particularly those who have been participating this morning as well as this afternoon. It's really the motivation for people like me who work in drug development in this area to hear from you, because we don't have that opportunity as much as our colleagues that are direct healthcare providers, and it's really motivating to hear that. My disclaimer is I'm an employee of Astellas Pharma, a pharmaceutical company. I've been working there 26 years, starting on the development of tacrolimus in 1990. But I'll be expressing the opinions today that are my own opinions, even though I've been working at the company for quite a long time. But they shouldn't be considered the opinions of Astellas. What I'd like to stress, and it has been touched on, a number of the themes already that I think will be great because they tie well into my presentation, is that I'm going to focus on pharmaceutical dosage forms that pharmaceutical companies could work on to help improve adherence. But I think it's important, as we just discussed, to realize this is a very complex, multifaceted issue of adherence. So I don't want to fool myself or anyone else to think that dosage form development is the answer. There is no magic bullet here. What we need to do is try to work together on all the different aspects of this, and one of the things that pharmaceutical industry can do is help in terms of regimen complexity as well as pharmaceutical dosage forms. So I'll be focusing in there with a big picture that this is one small element of the big of trying to address issues in adherence. So what can we do from the standpoint of dosage form technology, and what have we done in the industry to try to improve this? Probably the most fundamental one for oral drug development has been sustained release technologies. And there are a lot of different sustained release approaches, and with the main goal of trying to decrease the frequency of dosing. I'll talk a little bit about some of these from the standpoint of transplantation to give you more specifics there. But if you think about some of the products that are out there that have made a difference already outside of transplant in sustained release technology, there might be a couple of approaches. We were talking about difficulties with adolescence and adherence. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder medications used to be all immediate release, multi-doses per day, and sustained release technology came out. It really helped because those kids then didn't have to try to bring medications to school, didn't have to go to the nurse or somewhere else to get their ADHD drugs, didn't have to worry about trading those drugs or having someone acquire them while they're at school. So we don't really think about those things too much, but that's a big improvement in the lifestyle for an adolescent with ADHD that can be helped a lot just by a reduction in the dosing frequency. Another example is improving adverse events if they're associated with a high drug level. A very simple one, if you're taking niacin for the treatment of high triglycerides. If you take immediate release niacin, there's a very dramatic flushing that lots of people get. And if you just put it into a sustained release, you can dramatically reduce that amount of flushing and make it a tolerable medication for hypertriglyceridemia. The second approach I wanted to touch on was transdermal patch. We've talked a lot about those in the past. I believe that honestly they aren't applied all that frequently. But if you think about transdermal patches, What they can do is, one, decrease frequency of dosing because you can put a patch on for potentially days. You can also avoid the issue of the oral route of administration for people who have difficulty swallowing. So probably the most common ones you think about are scopolamine patches for people with motion sickness, nicotine patches that you see over the counter now for smoking cessation. Those have been very common. Within prescription products, probably the ones that have had the biggest breakthrough are things like opioids, using fentanyl patches for chronic pain control. Also, topically, testosterone. Most of testosterone replacement therapy is done topically, not necessarily in a patch, but counting on oral absorption. Because one of the advantages is when you put a drug on the skin rather than swallow it, it doesn't go through the liver. Most of the blood flow from the intestines goes initially through the liver. We call it first pass metabolism, and that will greatly affect some drugs. And this is a way of getting around that. Third is melting tablets. Some people call these melt dose or WOW tablets, without water tablets. It's not used too commonly, but it's another approach that oftentimes people have to run around and worry about where, if they have a source of water, right, to take all their medications. People have difficulty swallowing them. This is a way of pharmaceutical formulation where it will dissolve very rapidly in the mouth and reduce your need for water. Long-lasting injections. Most of the time when we have proteins or biologics, they can't be absorbed through the GI tract, so they can be put into an injection, hopefully that then can be dosed at a very infrequent time. But patients sometimes can do that at home with self-injections, particularly subcutaneous injections at home, but they may need to go to the clinic for their administration, but hopefully that will be infrequently. And then chewable tablets. I could probably put also sprinkles and granules and liquids into this group as well, all formulated to help make it easier to swallow, particularly in the pediatric populations that have difficulty with solid oral dosage forms and the size of them. And then lastly, fixed dose combinations. The simplest way to think of this is we've taken two drugs and put them into one pill. So commonly, you might see this in areas like hypertension, diabetes. I'll show a few of those. It's also used in antiviral therapies. And now you're seeing more and more products come out that combine things like a nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drug along with a drug to protect the gut, like a proton pump inhibitor or H2 blocker, so that you put them both together, one drug that protects against the side effects and one drug that causes that side effect, all in the same tablet or capsule. Another way of, and I'll show some of the data on how that affects adherence. So if we think about overall regimen complexity, there's a number of factors to consider. One is simply the number of doses and dose frequency per day. And I'll show data on once, twice, 3 times, 4 times a day dosing. But also just the total number of pills. It struck me this morning, people were talking about 20, 30 pills a day. The more the pills, the more complex, even if they're once or twice a day, simply the number makes a difference. The third is liquids versus solids. Liquids are harder. They're harder for people to carry around, for people to take. So we want to shoot for solid dosage forms if we can. One thing that was talked about a moment ago was the issue of taking products with food restrictions. So you go to the pharmacy and you get the little label on the side of your bottle that says take this on an empty stomach 1 hour before or 2 to 3 hours after a meal. That is actually the most complex. People have the hardest time trying to space drugs with that instruction. That's worse than saying take it with food. That's easier. And then the easiest, of course, is it doesn't matter whether it's on an empty stomach or with food. So we have to keep that in mind for the complexity of the regimen. Other things to think about: refrigeration. Patients don't have the ability to keep something on ice and at a low temperature, even though stability for some products is an issue. And then with the liquids, the issue of whether you have to reconstitute it. Is it a powder that you then have to add a liquid to? Again, that step adds to the complexity of the regimen. So these are all things that we have to consider. A lot of the work on this actually came out after the treatments, the antiretroviral treatments for HIV/AIDS, because they were concerned about all the multi-drug regimens and trying to maintain adherence in that setting. So what's the best? The best situation, and the patients described it this morning, was if you could take one tablet or capsule once a day, regardless of food, and take it in the morning. Right? That's the ideal scenario if we could accomplish that. That's the rarity, but that should be our goal for oral therapy if we can do that. Now I'm going to look at some of the data, both in and outside of transplant, in regards to adherence, but I want to put forward a couple of assumptions that I'm making. And one is that simplifying the dosing and reducing the complexity of the dosing should improve adherence, even when there are very few studies to show that. It's not, there's a lot of studies on adherence that you heard about earlier this afternoon, but not so many that really show the impact of just changing the dosage form. But I believe we have to go through the premise that the simplification and reduction in complexity is good, and we should strive for that. The other thing is that we tend to get hung up sometimes in our field on saying, but has it been studied in transplant patients? And so what I'd like to say is that we can extrapolate from other chronic diseases to transplantation. For instance, we know that diabetes, hypertension are very common amongst transplant patients. We've heard about that today. Hypertension is a good example of a fairly silent disease, like preventing rejection. Right? Normally everything is going fine until something big happens. So I think that these are valid areas to extrapolate to transplantation. So what do we have in terms of examples of dosage form technology for transplant immunosuppression? Actually very few if we focus just on immunosuppression. One that was talked about, introduced by Jack this morning, is Nulogix or belatacept, a once monthly, when it's in the maintenance phase, intravenous injection. So that's an area where if you are able to get to a clinic that can provide that once a month injection, it's a way of ensuring that patients have exposure over a full month with just that 1 hour injection. Now you do take other oral immunosuppressants along with it in the regimen, but it's sort of an all or none, right? If you get your injection, you've got a month's worth of immunosuppression, at least from that agent. So that's one approach. The other approach that has been used in transplantation is with tacrolimus, going from the immediate release twice daily formulation, which is how we originally launched it, to once a day formulations. There's 2 that are on the market in the US, Astograph XL and Envarsus XR. So let me start out first to say, if you're looking at once a day, does once a day versus multiple doses help? Now, I think it's fairly clear. We already heard from patients that that's desired. So I think all this does is validate the opinion that you have, but it's important to also look at that data. So this is a group of a systematic assessment of studies that used electronic monitoring. Rita talked about different monitoring methods for adherence. This is with electronic monitoring across numerous disease states, starting at the left side with once a day dosing all the way to 4 times a day dosing at the right. And somewhat intuitive to you, but shown by these studies, you can see that the average adherence rate drops as you go to increased number of doses per day, with 4 times being much worse than once a day, and once a day being the best. Fairly intuitive. You might say, does that hold up for a disease like hypertension where you're not symptomatic? And the answer is yes, it does. It's not as striking, the numbers, but once a day in hypertension is definitely better than twice a day and 3 times a day in this situation. And this was looking at if you took at least 80% of your prescribed meds. If you cut this at 90%, if that's your criteria, these differences actually even get bigger. The other thing is, what about a non-life-threatening but symptomatic disease like overactive bladder? Does it hold up there? This is oxybutynin, one of the most commonly used drugs in the US for treating overactive bladder. And once a day ER on the top line, you can see that has a much higher percentage of patients staying on therapy than when you go to multiple doses and an immediate release. And you see very low rates of 1 year persistence. Less than 10% of patients stay on twice a day oxybutynin for a year. It's remarkable how low the adherence rate is. Now, I just want to touch on what do we know about transplantation for once a day. There has been some studies done. One of the studies is of 219 patients where they're randomized to once a day versus twice a day TAC after kidney transplant, and then followed for 6 months. And what they found in this study was after a 3-month run-in period, and then there's that vertical line through the slide at the point of randomization. The top line is the once-a-day group. The bottom line is the twice-a-day group. And this is looking at the percentage of patients with correct dosing. And they're used an electronic system, so every day they could check on the dose. So that's every day you're looking at the compliance. And you'd see that they separate out. So once a day in transplant patients, you see higher percentage with correct dosing relative to twice a day. The other thing that was interesting about this study that taught us a little about human nature was they looked at the day of the week because they did this every day. And what you can see at each day of the week is that the evening doses, there's a higher rate of missed doses, that's the top line, than the morning doses. The other thing is the worst time is Saturday night. So Saturday night, I guess that's intuitive too, is the worst time in terms of compliance. Okay. The last thing I wanted to touch on was this idea of fixed dose combination. Fixed dose combination where you put 2 drugs into one dosage form compared to having to take 2 pills has been studied in diabetes and shown enhanced adherence rates. It's also been studied in hypertension with ACE inhibitors along with diuretics. These are the data on lisinopril in single pill versus 2, as well as the data on enalapril along with hydrochlorothiazide. So there's no doubt that combining in certain situations into one dosage form helps over 2. You could extrapolate this, and there's data to say that even if you package it together in a unit dose package so that patients get them both together, does help. It's the best to put it in the same pill. So let me end by saying I think that there's a number of pieces of data, there's a number of innovations that pharmaceutical companies can help with in terms of enhancing adherence through dosage form development, but there are some limitations. And as we heard well today, transplant patients are on multi-drug regimens just for the immunosuppression, let alone all the other indications they're taking. So just going from twice a day to once a day to tacrolimus, but then you have to take twice a day mycophenolate and you have to take all your other medications, doesn't mean we've solved the issue. Secondly, that when you looked at that list of possibilities, a lot of people say, well, you should do all those things with your drugs. Why aren't you making all those different dosage forms? The reality is we're limited by the science of the chemistry as well as the pharmacokinetic, or how a drug moves through the body of those molecules that sometimes make it impossible. Sometimes we can't get it to go into solution to make a liquid. We can't get it to go through the skin. So we do what we can, but it's not we don't have the ability to apply it in all circumstances. And lastly, that what we try to do is speed drugs to market, particularly to get it to patients in need. And almost always we don't know everything there is to know about the dosage regimen, nor have the best formulation. We have a good formulation, we know as much as we can to get the drug out on the market, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And so once the drugs are generic, there's some disincentive for doing some of the work to enhance these formulations. So we need to work on together to make this practical, to do it quicker, less expensive, and with less complexity, so that we can get some of these innovations out in terms of new formulations to enhance adherence. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Dr. Du, is coming back from the University of Pittsburgh.
Okay, I'm going to briefly review the evidence that we have about adherence in heart, lung, and liver transplant in adults, and then Dr. Chisholm Burns will cover kidney transplant intervention studies. There are a number of challenges if you think about what can transplant programs do in order to help their patients maintain adherence or improve adherence to the regimen after a transplant. People go to big centers. They may live thousands of miles away from the center where they got their transplant. Transplant teams have limited resources that they're constantly having to justify to their institutions. We've already talked about how adherence to the regimen is really composed of a number of different elements. There haven't been many interventions tested directly in transplantation, and we really don't have powerful interventions from other chronic disease populations. We have some, but they are only modestly effective. So the key issues are when, where, and how to intervene with transplant recipients. This is adapted from a review that was focused on hypertension, and in this review they pointed out that adherence problems can develop anywhere from shortly after the onset of treatment or care all the way through the very long term, and that's come up in some of the comments today as well. So over on the left side, if you think about in the transplant case, when you have the surgery as the beginning point, then you can think about the period after transplantation as in the first year, dealing with things like maybe trouble initially getting into the routine, low motivation to get into that routine, the onset of intolerable side effects that inhibit adherence, confusion about the regimen. Then as time goes on and you move over towards the right-hand side here, there may be delayed toxicity that creeps up over time. It may be hard for the person to sustain their motivation to adhere to the regimen. And so those kinds of problems can develop in the long term. In terms of where and how to intervene, if you look at the chronic disease literature in general, we only have a fixed number of possibilities concerning the mode of offering the intervention. We might do it face-to-face at discharge or at clinic visits. Could be done on the telephone, through smartphone apps, or through other kinds of internet or web-based applications. And then in terms of what the interventions could be composed of, these are sort of the fixed set of elements that people usually begin with when they try to put together an intervention, some educational component or maybe solely education, behavioral aspects, problem-solving therapy, for example, teaching people how to use certain techniques to deal with new problems, focusing on psychological aspects, using motivational interviewing, which is not interviewing, but trying to bring out the person's motivation, their own motivation for doing something, technology-based approaches, and then multi-component strategies that put these things together in novel packages. In chronic disease, we know that the types of interventions that have been used across studies are very heterogeneous. People have tried a lot of different approaches, but in looking across the literature, it's the things that are multi-component that seem to be the most effective. So you don't just offer education, you offer education plus some kind of problem solving, or education plus some psychoaffective kind of element. It can be difficult then to say what element of this multi-component intervention is the thing that's really potent, but the fact remains that it seems to be the synergy of different elements that matters. We know that effectiveness is increased by tailoring it to the patient needs, so you don't just use a one-size-fits-all intervention strategy, and also tailoring it to incorporate dynamic information, meaning that if you used one of the medication monitoring systems and you got feedback on the times that you were most likely to miss doses, that kind of dynamic information on how you've been doing lately could be really useful for how to improve in the future. We know also from this literature that the degree of impact is variable, but it tends to be small to moderate at best. So no intervention is hugely effective, but it has resulted in measurable improvements. And whether interventions improve clinical outcomes is a whole other issue. Many intervention studies don't address that issue. Finally, new mobile health strategies appear promising and are really increasing in terms of visibility in the literature. So then what do we know directly in transplant? Well, I'm going to focus on the extrarenal studies, the heart, liver, and lung studies. There have been descriptive reports with no evaluation, so we really can't say anything about whether they're helpful or not, except anecdotally sometimes they seem to be helpful. There have only been 6 trials to date that have actually looked at interventions in heart, liver, and lung recipients. 2 of them I'm not going to talk about. They were just education, and they showed that education alone doesn't work. There have been 2 others that used electronic platforms, and those were done by our group in Pittsburgh, and then 2 others that used face-to-face multi-component interventions, and both of them were done in Europe. So these 4 studies I'm going to talk about because they did show some evidence of effectiveness. About 10, 12 years ago, we did a study focused on heart recipients, and we developed a website that was multi-component. It had education, it had a question and answer library, it had discussion groups, and it had coping skills workshops that, as you can see here, one focused on managing stress and the other focused on managing the medical regimen. So it was a short trial, and we compared people who used the intervention to historical controls who were the same amount of time post-transplant. And what we found was that their mental health, even in this short 4-month trial period, improved relative to the controls. Recipient adherence improved in some areas, but it was only among the people that actually used that component of the website. Recipient social functioning and their quality of life in that area improved, and we found a dose-response relationship between the frequency of the website use, no matter what component they used, and intervention effects. But the issue is that the sample was small, it wasn't randomized, even though it was a prospective study and it had a short study period. More recently, we focused on a large randomized trial in lung recipients, and we were testing a smartphone app called PocketPath. And PocketPath gave the user a variety of tools that they could use on their phone to monitor what they were recording. So rather than using paper and pencil logs, they could record information about their spirometry, their temperature, their blood pressure, and so on directly into this app. And they could see both a listing of what they had recorded, but over on the right there at the bottom, the most important thing was they could see graphs. They could see how their numbers were trending over time, and it had critical values so that they got an alert if they were going outside of their critical range or if they were showing good improvements or whatever, and that kind of feedback seemed really important. So in this trial, we randomized patients at discharge and we compared them to a usual care group, and we found that those that had the app were more frequent in their self-monitoring, had higher regimen adherence across the board to all of the elements. They were more likely to report abnormal indicators to the team. We didn't find effects on rehospitalization or first-year mortality. So this just shows graphically the self-monitoring difference for PocketPath versus usual care. The higher bars, the green bars for PocketPath, showed that self-monitoring was higher and adherence was higher, but you can see that for everybody, adherence declined over the first year. So PocketPath helped, but it didn't prevent what we always see, which is that adherence generally does worsen over time in almost everybody, transplant or not. This study didn't follow people past their first year post-transplant. However, a follow-up report that's just going to come out now, it was under review when I did these slides, but now it's going to be published, looked at subsequent years and did find that the people who benefited from PocketPath in the first year did show a lower mortality risk in subsequent years, up to about 6 years post-transplant. And then we've more recently been testing a version of this for adolescents called Teen PocketPath, which focuses only on medication use. And again, is a smartphone app that helps them to monitor that, to see their trends in taking it, and to contact the team as appropriate. The third intervention out of the 4 that I'll discuss is a face-to-face pharmacist-led educational and monitoring intervention. It was done in Germany and involved a very small group of 41 liver recipients, but they were randomized, so that was a great strength of the study. It used education as well as quarterly meetings with the pharmacists to review their medications, their lab values, any problems they were having, and so on. And this slide, it shows box plots. The point of the slide is that the higher box on the left is showing better dosing compliance. They were more likely to open this electronic pill bottle with the correct number of openings per day than the control group, which has a lower box, which was not as good at doing that. So the intervention was effective from that standpoint. They also found higher target serum levels. They didn't find effects in every area. For example, self-reported adherence didn't change, and graft rejections didn't change either. But the issue, again, is that the follow-up period was short and the sample was small. Lastly, the Maestro study, which has just been completed recently in Belgium and is almost accepted as a publication. It was presented at an international meeting in the spring, is a really nice example that involved heart, lung, or liver patients. It had a long follow-up period. All the patients were beyond the first year post-transplant when they were randomized, and this intervention focused on giving them feedback using electric monitoring, so it was the dynamic information that I mentioned earlier. It helped them with goal setting and action plans. They had social support and education, and it used motivational interviewing to draw out the motivations for people to want to adhere closely to their regimen. It was also tailored based on their initial level of difficulty. They looked at adherence outcomes at up to 12 months after the baseline, and then they looked at clinical event-free survival over 5 years. So they found that they did have an effect on adherence. They had only a marginal effect on clinical event-free survival. So this is a graph of the adherence effect. You can see the green bar is the intervention group. They had better dosing adherence. It was about the same at baseline. By intervention end, it was clearly better. And notably, they maintained that over the subsequent 12 months, even though they were no longer getting components of the intervention. So it went beyond pocket path and showed durability. The problem is that it may not be feasible in a given transplant program's practice because it's a relatively complex, labor-intensive intervention, and you might have to have somebody that was dedicated to offering that intervention. So to conclude, there are very few studies in heart, liver, or lung recipients relative to about 3 or 4 times as many in kidney recipients. Education alone does not work, even though clinicians, if you ask them what works, they say education, that's what's going to work. It doesn't work. Multi-component strategies can improve adherence, but tailoring is needed, I think, to make them maximally effective. And most studies to date have had just short follow-up periods, so the durability and impact remains not as well understood. Thank you. So Dr. Chisholm Burns, who hasn't been introduced before, is the Dean and Professor, College of Pharmacy, Professor of Surgery, College of Medicine at the University of Tennessee.
Thank you, Mary Amanda. Also want to thank you for inviting me here today. I'm humbled by the experience. I always like to see my fellow colleagues and present with them. We've been presenting over the years on different issues. So again, thank you for inviting me. I also want to thank you guys out there for reminding me of why we do what we do, and it's because of you. So again, thanks for allowing me to share this time with you. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about interventions to improve adherence among the adult renal transplant population. And as you recap and think about today, you learned, or we talked about many things, all the way from organ donation to polypharmacy therapy to adverse drug events, cost, rejection, whose responsibility is it anyway in terms of adherence, and sorry, Peter, on that one. I know it was a hard call. Are we too passive about adherence? We also talked about, you reminded us about engaging patients, empowering you guys, what I call self-efficacy. And so what I'm going to try to do is kind of tie all of this together using 2 studies to do that, 2 studies that I have been involved in over my career looking at adherence. And among the 6 or 7 that I've done that looked at intervention groups, I think these 2 are the ones that could tie this together the best. The first one was published in the American Journal of Transplantation a couple of years ago. And it looked at improving outcomes of renal transplant recipients with behavioral contracts. You might be thinking, oh, now that's really heavy, a contract, right? This is like closing on a house or going to make me sign something. Now I'm liable and responsible. But I don't want you to get caught up in that. This is just a mechanism, a medium, if you will, that we use to make the healthcare professional and the patient pause to talk about adherence. And you talked about that. Let's pause. Let's make them do it and talk about adherence. So let me give you a little bit of background about behavioral contracting. I know this came up in Mary Amanda's talk. All it really is a behavior modification technique, which is grounded in social cognitive theory, in which there's patient-specific written agreements or a contract, if you will, that's developed between an individual, patient, and a healthcare professional. So it's not a legally binding contract, okay? It's just a way to pause, to get some thoughts written down on paper, and I have a copy of the contract. It's a one-page sort of deal. And what this contract does is identifies a target behavior. In this case, the target behavior is medication adherence, specifically immunosuppressive therapy adherence. And it looks at those factors that influence that behavior. Okay, and we talked about a lot of those factors here today. Cost, and I know that's probably the elephant in the room. I had a discussion earlier today with an individual that is pretty high up in one of the pharmacy chains, and I know the question was put forth to the group about changing drug vendors. And a lot of that sometimes is controlled by a lot of other factors, including PBMs and things of that nature. But anyway, it's looking at factors that control that behavior and proposes strategies to modify the target behavior to achieve a desired outcome. So all the factors that you talked about, all the factors that we didn't talk about, because it's very individualized. And so in this study, again, we looked at adults. So the study included renal transplant recipients who were 21 years of age or older, who were at least 1 year post-transplant. So these were people that probably for the most part they were established on a drug therapy. They were prescribed tacrolimus or cyclosporin. They obtained their immunosuppressive therapy from a specialty pharmacy, and I know someone made a comment about that earlier, and they had to be enrolled in a specialty pharmacy for at least 1 year prior to study enrollment and during the entire study period. Now, participants in the intervention group met with the study pharmacist at baseline to negotiate the behavioral contract, then again at months 3, 6, 9 to review the contract, to discuss progress toward the goal, which again is to achieve the highest possible adherence that we could, to update the contract, and to re-sign the contract for the next quarterly period. And they met the last time at the 12 months to terminate the contract. Now, what did the behavioral contract address? Well, it addressed several factors, including the motivations for achieving the immunosuppressive therapy adherence. Today I've heard people talk about they want to be adherent because they want to be around for their loved ones, or they want to participate in a particular activity. So the motivations, again, done on a very individualized scale. They address barriers that interfere with adherence to that particular person, and solutions to these barriers, which can include social support. We also looked at other tools and strategies to help remind the renal transplant recipient of the dosing schedule and possible consequences of non-adherence. So tying the whole picture together. Now, participants in the control group received standard or usual care. So once we applied our criteria to the patients, we had 286 patients in this particular pharmacy that actually met the criteria. I need to tell you that it was a multi-site intervention, and it was spread over several states. Most of the states were in the southwestern part of the United States, so I didn't live all my life in the state of Tennessee. So I was out south in the southwestern part for a little while. And 286 people met the study criteria. 150 people were accepted into the study, and at the end we had 67 individuals in the intervention group and 68 individuals in the control group. In terms of results, there were no significant differences between the intervention and the control groups based on patient characteristics. So for the most part, the patient characteristics, the big global ones, were the same. I have to tell you, and we've seen this throughout many of the talks today. I know Mary Amanda mentioned it, and Peter mentioned it when he looked at Nevin's study of 2014, that baseline adherence was associated with months post-transplants, meaning the further you were out from transplant, the lower your adherence rate became in most cases. But no other factors or characteristics were associated with adherence at baseline. Now, the intervention group has significantly greater adherence compared to the control group at months 6, 9, and 12 months, and over the entire study period. And that's what's really depicted in this graph. So you have a line graph here. On the y-axis, you have the month post-study enrollment. On the y-axis, you have the compliance rate. If you multiply that by 100, you get the compliance rate or the percentage. The solid line represents the intervention group. The dotted line represents the control group. And you clearly could see that the lines diverged. However, just like Nevin's study in 2014, you didn't really see this line diverging until after the third month post-study enrollment. And you could see clearly that the intervention group, as I said earlier, had better adherence. Now, I will tell you that we did follow these people after the 12-month study period. We actually followed them out 3 months after post that period, so a total of 15 months. And this study did hold. The intervention group still had higher compliance rates or adherence rates compared to the control group. In terms of cost, in terms of cost, as we looked at healthcare utilizations and in particular hospitalizations, 40% of the patients reported hospitalizations during the study. And if you look at the two groups, 57% of the control group was hospitalized during that 12-month study period, compared to only 24% in the intervention group. And this really boiled down, if you want to look at the cost again, not to mention all the other things that's associated with hospitalizations, like quality of life, but just looking at the cost alone. The intervention group was 78% more likely to be hospitalized, saving $28,000 a month in healthcare costs. So what did we conclude at the end of this study? For us, having multiple sites out there around the country, we concluded that behavioral contracting is a practical and easy to employ adherence strategy that resulted in several significant improvements, one in adherence and the other in decreased healthcare costs. So just to recap this study, it was done, again, in multiple sites. So you, I believe, talked about scalability. This has the scalability potential. Again, you had to stop and pause and engage in the discussion. I want to present to you another study, which was a study that was done at one site. It was in a renal transplant clinic at the Medical College of Georgia. Now that institution has been renamed to Augusta University. But we looked at the impact of clinical pharmacy services on renal transplant patients' compliance with immunosuppressive medications. And again, a multi-component study where we did lots of things to help with adherence, very individualized, similar to what you saw in the first study. Again, this study involved adult renal transplant recipients, and since it was done in a center, we had some clinic data that we could go to as well. So everyone who received a renal transplant clinic at the Medical College of Georgia over a 2-year time period was evaluated to see if they met study criteria. The study criteria included they had to be at least 18 years of age. This had to be their primary transplant, meaning that they couldn't have any graft loss prior to this. And they had to receive follow-up care at our institution and receive their medications from our institution's pharmacy. After receiving informed consent, patients were randomized just like the other study, into one of two groups, an intervention or a control group. Patients in the control group received traditional services, which meant no clinical pharmacist interventions, while patients in the intervention group were seen by the clinical pharmacist at each clinic visit, and they interacted with the clinical pharmacist at least on a monthly basis. Now, what were the clinical pharmacy's duties? Well, they included performing medication reviews with the emphasis on preventing or resolving medication-related problems, monitoring therapy, providing medication recommendations and drug information, increasing patients' access to medication, and I know that was one of the things that you guys talked about earlier, the access, and encouraging patients' compliance to medications. This study was a small study. It involved 24 patients, 12 in each group. You could see that there were no differences between the two groups in terms of gender, age, whether they received a living-related donor, kidney transplant, or a deceased donor, as well as no differences between race or ethnicity. This graph, you've seen something similar to it before, but I do want to remind you, this study differs in the first study in that the month post-study enrollment is also the month post-transplant, so these are freshly or new transplants. The other one was out a year, so they kind of developed some patterns before we got to them. Again, re-emphasizing the point that many of my colleagues made, the point that Dr. Nickerson talked about in Dr. Nevin's study, is that you really didn't see a big divergence in adherence until after the 4th month. And then you could see that yellow line, which is the intervention group, and that control group, that red line, where you see the decrease in adherence. So it does happen early on in the post-transplant time period. So the message here is that the intervention group had a statistically higher compliance rate compared to the control group. Now, since we had clinic data, we could triangulate the compliance rate. And so in both of these studies, we looked at refill records. However, with this study, we were also able to look at immunosuppressive drug concentrations. And we found that more people in the intervention group were in the desired therapeutic range with their drug concentrations compared to those individuals in the control group. And that was statistically significant as well. Now, the study wasn't powered to look at graft rejections, but I will tell you that 2 people in the control group had graft rejections compared to 0 people in the intervention group, leading to some of the other things that you guys talked about. In terms of the economics, we didn't see any differences in hospital costs, as well as clinic visit, emergency room visit, or total cost between the intervention and the control group. But we did see a statistical difference in the cost of the medications, with the intervention group having a lower cost of medications compared to the control group. And that's really, really important. What we found is when we look back at the interventions that the clinical pharmacist was making, many of them involved discontinuing medications that the patient didn't need to be on. There was a lot of duplications in medications. There was a lot of doses that could be decreased. So that was something that we keyed into. And as we looked at more and more into the cost of the medications, we found that patients in the intervention group had a mean total cost charge of about $2,600 less per patient than patients in the control group. And that equaled to about $68,000 just for the intervention group alone. So looking at both of these studies, we came up with some conclusions in summary. That interventions have been developed that successfully improve IST adherence in transplant recipients. Again, as my colleagues have said, most of these are multi-component interventions, and they're very individualized interventions. And I believe, as well as my colleagues, that resources should be devoted to implementation of evidence-based interventions on a very scalable or large-scale medium. So with that, I want to thank my funding sources that include NIH, as well as the Carlos and Marguerite Mason Trust fun. I want to thank all of you here today, and I want to thank you guys for inviting me. With that said, I want to introduce the man who reminded me that my child is in adolescence ever since I met him. And so if you could come up here, and that's Dr. Robert Edinger. We know that he's a distinguished research professor emeritus with the Department of Pediatrics, Division of Nephrology and Mattel's Children's Hospital, as well as the School of Medicine at UCLA. So thank you very much.
So I have, excuse me, but I have only one thing to say to you, and that is, Mom! Okay, so quickly, let's talk about what interventions can improve medication adolescence and outcomes. And I think this is very much of an open question. The first question, of course, is what is a successful intervention? And as I mentioned, we tend to talk about taking adherence because that's what we know, but what we really want to be able to measure is the absence of adverse biological outcomes, and that's a much more difficult situation because of the human condition and different immune responses and metabolisms, etc. In addition, different developmental stages, different barriers, and different emotional problems require different approaches. And so, as has been said, one size does not fit all, and nothing is really more characteristic in adolescent outcomes than one size does not fit all. We can't have just one intervention, unfortunately. We have to tailor the intervention to the family and to the patient. The inherent problems with adherence in adolescence really revolve around the adolescents being concerned with the here and now. As we talked about, there is no pain due to missed medications. In addition, and something that is very, very important, and something that adult centers that are trying to take care of adolescent patients will tend not to pick up on, is that adolescents benefit from immediate feedback and from incentives. And I'm going to be coming back to immediate feedback and incentives again and again. So, from my standpoint, having done this, and I will say not immodestly, we just counted up all the transplants that have been taken care of at UCLA since I got there, and we just passed 1,000. So I know I look like I'm only 35 years old, but that's not quite the case. What are the minimal practical guidelines to which to build a successful adherence in adolescent medicine transplantation? Number one, and quite important, is the medical team's communication with the family. We need an interactional model rather than we and they. The approach needs to be judgmental, and we need to avoid selective attribution. I always start when I'm asking about issues with my adolescents, I'm talking one-on-one with them, I'll always say, I know it's hard to take the medications routinely every single time. Let's talk about this. You really want to stress a team approach. Kids respond well to teams, so patient, parents, healthcare providers represent the team. And in fact, personal chemistry develops better with a nurse coordinator sometimes, as we've heard before, than with the doctor, so that we utilize different individuals to ferret out the presence or absence of medication non-adherence. What sort of post-transplant interventions do we need to put in routinely, even before we start to do any research in one versus another? What do we need to be doing routinely to intervene and improve adherence? Number one, we need to continually educate with every visit. On an individual basis, medication non-adherent behavior can fluctuate dramatically over time. So what was right this month is not going to be right 6 months from now. And so these kids, therefore, need to be seen more frequently to provide continual reinforcement, even years after transplant. That's sometimes a difficult pill. And, I was really interested in talking about not intrusive versus too intrusive. We are most certainly in the pediatric transplant arena regarded as too intrusive, because we'll bring these kids back every 6 weeks, 2 months, if we think that there are any issues at all. What happens all too often, and I just admit I was on call Sunday night, and what happened Sunday night? A kid who was taken care of at another center, hadn't been seen in 4 months, came into UCLA because they weren't feeling very well, and the creatinine, which had been 2.0, was 11. And the kid had not been seen for 4 months because he didn't need, he was long out. He was 4 years out afterwards and didn't need to be seen. And he had stopped his meds. So unfortunately, we need to see these kids more frequently. Finally, we need to address parent and patient psychological and social problems promptly, and that goes along with seeing these kids frequently. Now, I'm not going to cover each of these areas because Mary Amanda sort of this I took from some of her writing about the different sorts of interventions, but it's important to highlight a few things. With regard to counseling and behavioral interventions, we want to try to change behavior to empower adolescents to participate in their own care. And to develop new skill sets. And you'll see how at least one controlled trial is doing that. We want to try to be alert to the psychological and affective issues of the kids, addressing their feelings, emotion, and their social relationships. We tend to perform mixed interventions because one size does not fit all. And almost everything in the literature now is multi-component interventions. But again, I want to come to a few issues with the immunobiological. Number one, tolerance induction is something that really needs to be considered not only in the adults where it's being tried in some centers, but it needs to be really conceptualized in adolescents, because these are the poster children for non-adherence. And yet, they want to show it in adults first. Well, the big risk in situations is not with the adults not taking their medicines near as much as with the adolescents not taking their medicines. Peter has written about improved matching, so I'm not going to be discussing that too much. But I do want to say something about the last point here, and that's the simplifying the drug regimen or reducing the drug burden. A number of the, and I'm addressing this to my colleagues and friends on the left. I don't mean the left political spectrum, I mean the left, my left hand. But those interventions, like once-a-day Tacro, like belatacept, is available to adult patients. They are not available to my adolescents because we don't know the pharmacokinetics of the once-daily drugs. They haven't been adequately reported, that they're not approved in pediatrics. Belatacept, we don't know the pharmacokinetics because the study is just now being completed, and we're not going to have a controlled trial to meet FDA requirements until at the very least 2018. We need to get these drugs into the hands of pediatric nephrologists to help manage these things, to help ameliorate the issues of medication non-adherence. I will go only briefly mention with regard to the cognitive and educational interventions is that while educational interventions are important, educational interventions alone are insufficient by themselves to improve adherence. However, an area that needs to be targeted, if we are going to target adherence improvements in pediatrics, is in that middle bar that I showed you, that I'm showing you. Useful interventions have to be targeted during the period of time when patients and families are transferring responsibility from parent-directed care to self-adolescent care. General considerations with regard to intervention adherence. Multi-component adherence probably have the highest effectiveness, but treatment effects are strongest immediately after intervention and dissipate over time. Just as we have heard, and it's very true in adolescence, that laid out you see this non-adherence. In fact, in addition, we can put in interventions. They may work for the 12 months that we're putting them in, but if we don't follow them up and continue to follow these closely, then all that work that has been done in that year is just not going to be useful. So interventions that study a specific area of time have to be generalizable for longer periods of time. Finally, and something again to remember, there were few randomized controlled trials in pediatrics. One randomized controlled trial, the results of which have not been reported, are the Take It study done by Beth Foster up in Canada, and Mary Amanda has been participating. And they utilize a multi-dose pill box. They use therapeutic drug level variability monitoring, and they're looking at biological outcomes, and they're identifying the patients by the barriers that I mentioned in my first talk, and trying to develop problem-solving skills and developing concrete contingency plans for specific occasions to develop appropriate strategies if the kids are in situations where they're not able to take them, so to develop the best habits for medication adherence. PTSD, something that I think may resonate with some of you out there, has been studied by Eyal Shemesh and reported back in 2000. PTSD is characterized by re-experiencing of emotions, avoidance, and hyperarousal responses from previous trauma. So they did a PTSD response index in 19 liver transplant kids, and 6 of the 19 had positive scores in all 3 components of the PTS responsive index. 3 of the 6 patients had documented non-adherence, and the PTSD was treated in these 3 patients with good subsequent adherence. So the PTSD that somebody mentioned this morning is in fact maybe an important component of adherence and has not been addressed in the study since the year 2000. So this is clearly an area that we need more work on. It's also important, and I don't know if the mother of the pediatric recipient is here, but PTSD has also been reported in the parents of pediatric recipients. A word about simplifying the drug measurement. It's been recently reported by an ex-trainee and a colleague of Dr. Nickerson's, Tom Blythe-Hansen, that poor adherence is significantly associated with increased medication frequency in pediatric CKD patients, so this is true with peds as well as adults. So one should consider and study forgiving medication regimens. And one hypothesis that I have liked is that a once-daily regimen of sirolimus and low-dose TAC with once-daily TAC or monthly belatacept can be a regimen best suited for adolescents. The problem is, as I said, neither of these are available to me to try right now. One danger, of course, with once-a-day dosing is missing 1 dose really means missing 2 doses because patients are missing morning and evening. They're missing a whole day of dose. Does this put the patient at some increased risk? In any situation where we're studying adolescents, to look at once-daily dosing should probably be answering this question. Nonetheless, the table that, or the graph that was shown by Bill Fitzsimmons just before shows that the evening doses are clearly the problems, and we know our kids, our adolescents like to be out in the evening. A word very quickly about transition from pediatric-centered care to adult-centered care. We tend to transfer our kids when we have to, which means transferring them when the law says we have to, rather when They're developmentally able to be transferred, and care in a pediatric center is different than care in an adult center. And we see, as I show in the first bar, transfer to adult center care is associated with worsening clinical outcomes. Single transition clinics may work and may be helpful, but they are resource heavy, and we don't have a lot of them right now. But this is another area that we really need to aim at. Text messaging. The last two slides are going to be about new developments, mobile health, etc. So what about text messaging and adolescent adherence? With regard to text messaging, the pros are convenience. It addresses forgetfulness and possibility of instant feedback. The cons, unfortunately, are costs. There's cell service that has to be maintained by the patient and can be intermittent at times, so the text may not get through, and the patients may get burnt out. And there are actually focus groups asking adolescent groups who have been participating in this, why don't they acknowledge the text messages anymore? Because, as we know, adolescents will sometimes turn us off. Text messaging has been utilized successfully in liver transplants when you're transferring care from pediatric, parent-directed care to adolescent self-care, but there's likely additional interventions are going to be needed in addition to just the text messaging. Finally, two new provocative developments, and this literally, I found this headline shown on the left. The Proteus ingestible sensor system is now being used in pediatric organ transplant patients. I'm not sure how well adolescents are going to adjust. The way this ingestible sensor works is you take a pill where a small wafer, a vegetable wafer that sends a very weak cell signal, is swallowed, goes to the stomach, the pill goes to the stomach, the sensor sends a message to an abdominal or arm patch, which goes to a phone, which sends a message to the doctor, you took your medicine. This has been tested in adults, is being beta in pediatrics. It's an interesting system. It does have some technical issues, and I don't know how many kids are going to go around wearing a bandage on their arm, but it's one other issue. Directly observed therapy is the best way for us to see that kids have taken medications. It has been tried in front of computer screens with adolescents with sickle cell anemia using a computer platform, and has been found to be successful in getting kids to take their medications. There's a new platform called AI Cure, which uses facial recognition with a smartphone. Kids take the medications as they're, or not kids at this point, but only adults are taking their medications. It's used in certain clinical trials. I happened to ask one of our audience and one of the previous panelists, would you do this if you were an adolescent? And she said, no, it's too intrusive. But then I said, well, what if we made it worth your while and gave you some extra message units, and bought you a message plan? She goes, I'd have to think about that. So adolescents are quite a challenging area. We can use new technology, but we're going to have to work with the hands we've been dealt, and the hands we've been dealt with adolescents sometimes require some extra work. At any rate, I want to thank you very much for your attention. I turn it back over to the crew.
Thank you to all the panelists. I would, as a non-expert in organ transplant, I can speak that it's very appreciative that all of the panel presentations were very much, you could tell that you were keeping the non-experts in mind when you prepared those, and I found them to be, and I'm seeing head nods, that it's very much appreciated. Thank you. We have a lot of questions in this session. I think we get to dip into a little time. We're actually there are a couple open public comment, and we're just going to wrap that up at the end of this session. So we can go for about a half hour with this conversation. And in looking at the questions, they really boil down to three main topics. One is, of all the things we've heard about to help and promote adherence, what resonates? That's questions 1, 2, and 1, 3, and 4. And then there are some questions about resources and can we develop drugs that can solve some of these problems. So let's focus first on what has resonated about the efforts to promote adherence. I'm going to first ask, I'm going to call on Kevin. With your advocate hat on and thinking globally, what of the strategies that you heard speaking, what resonated with you? What kind of thoughts came through your mind?
Well, I think most of it's, to use a computer terminology, ease of use. You know, the easier the regimen is, and we've already talked about it. 1 pill a day, with or without food, is ideal. And the closer we move to that, I think the more compliant everyone's going to be.
Okay. In the participants here, anything that really resonated you with about strategies that could help address adherence? Kevin, wait for the mic.
I think just going back to Dr. Du, your presentation, just the whole part, your message is understand your population, develop a strategy that's specific to those people. I don't think there's one size fits all. I think the work you do there proves what my intuition has said, so I would support that.
Okay. Anyone else? Right here.
I was dreaming a little bit when the Astellas representative said something about combining the drugs, right? I mean, then I had this magical, I felt like I just woke up. I said, oh my God, my Prograf and CellCep and everything is combined in one pill, and it's going to be so easy, right? And I doubt that you'll ever get to Genentech and, try to combine a pill, and because there's so many different doses and there's so many different different ways to take it, but that would be huge, right? I mean, I'm a chronic patient, but I know everyone here is a chronic patient too, and I am on Prograf, by the way. You know what I mean? I'm not on generic. So yeah, if they could do that, that'd be huge.
Okay. Right here.
Use patient-established support groups. Patient-established support groups. I can give you examples. At HUP, there is a website established. It's a Facebook. Actually, it's a private Facebook group on the internet, established by one patient several years ago, and now there are about 130 members.
Okay.
And these members interact, not even daily, like hourly with each other, and lots of topics being discussed, and the members provide support of each other, and lots of information being exchanged. And I think, especially for adolescents, if somehow like providers could find a couple of young patients who would start a group,
Okay.
they may be able to influence their peers much better than the informal settings.
Great. So in case you couldn't hear Miklos, what he was saying was the patient-directed support groups, and he gave Facebook as an example. Has anyone, or is anyone currently or have been a part of those support groups? Okay. Anyone else want to talk about the positive or negative effect that it's had? Go ahead, Heather. And speaking of adherence.
Right? Yeah. I think in a way there's a little more. I guess you have people discussing how long they've been out and the positive. You can ask. Well, how did you do that? I mean, in fact, that was one of the things I did. I was like, I need all the information I can. Is it exercise? Is it I never even assumed people stop taking their medications for good. That never occurred to me. I mean, but that is one of the things you hear. It's like, oh, this medication's causing me so many problems. What have you done? And you'll get 15 replies that are really useful. Others are just, I'm praying for you. There's all that. But it's so informative because you can at least feel like, oh, I'm not the only one with nausea. And this person, he took, something to help it, or that doctor said this. So at least it gives you something to ask your doctor. It gives you more pointed questions. So I find it's been helpful. But can I mention something? I did have a reply for the thing, because I thought when we were talking the interventional studies that you were talking about, if that could become, if we can convince our groups that that is something, because we were talking about the psychological issues and the post-traumatic stress and all that, and I'm wondering now that you do have some studies out there where this intervention is useful, is cost effective, if that couldn't be something that could be part of the overall care across the board. It just seems right.
Okay. Go back.
So regarding the discussion on support groups and how it affects adherence, and one of the things I'm known as at Cincinnati Children's among patients and families is Uncle Jack. We need to bring Uncle Jack in to have a conversation with one of the patients, right? Because being able to relate to somebody who's been through it before and isn't going to necessarily have that position of authority, right, as the doctor or as a parent, and what are the consequences, right? There's no consequences by talking to somebody who's already been through it and, made mistakes in managing the care for themselves previously, and really sharing that, so that they're not able to, they don't make those same types of mistakes.
Mm-hmm. We'll go here with Piper and then Kevin, and then we're getting good stuff here. We're going to keep going.
Follow from Uncle Jack over here. But I think, and I've had a conversation with Dr. Nickerson about this too, but I think the one thing to look at this too is that you have an untapped resource with patients. So when I had my transplant, my level of wanting to help that first year was so high, but when I wanted to go reach out to the center and support groups to help, the reception wasn't positive. So I think that, there's a lot of people that really want to help. It doesn't have to be that difficult. You find some trusted people that you can do, and you've got people who are going to be the ambassadors to get the message and reinforce the right behaviors. It's not that hard.
With Piper.
Okay, I hope I don't get too much backlash for this one from other patients. But I do want to say that there's a little bit of a problem, particularly in lung transplant. There's not a lot of standardization of care across centers. And I think some of the support groups can actually cause difficulties for people because they hear, for example, oh, my center says it's fine to eat sushi. I mean, I've actually heard that. And then, for most lung transplant centers, they'll say, no, you can't do that. And it becomes a little difficult because there might be reasons that doctors are telling one particular patient that they can't do X or Y or Z, whereas other patients can. And I think that sometimes a little bit of defiance against the centers. For example, my lung transplant center does not allow the use of alcohol at all. Some centers seem to allow that, and then so patients sort of see it and they think, oh, well, maybe I can use it sometimes. But then they might not be honest with their doctors because they know that their doctors don't want them using it. And it sort of creates this instability, I think, of communication. So I think working on standardizing, or at least getting some consensus on the proper way to care for patients is something that could really help maybe make the benefit of those support groups a little more tangible.
Great. Thank you, Piper. Come here with Layla.
Yeah. Is the mic on? Okay. I feel as though social media and support groups have really held me to a certain level of accountability, because as I talk to other patients who are coming up behind me or who are dealing with transplants or who are on dialysis, I find myself feeling like, okay, I have to take my medicine now because these people are watching me. And if I've already self-appointed myself as support for them, I do also share the good and the bad. I discuss my process and just certain days where I'm not feeling so happy-go-lucky as I'm supposed to feel post-transplant. And I think they really value that authenticity. And also working with the Peers program with National Kidney Foundation, as I talk to my mentees and they have questions about post-transplant or things I went through on dialysis, I can go home and I reflect and I'm like, okay, it's humbling for me. I used to be on dialysis. I could be back there. So let me pull it together. Whatever it is I'm dealing with right now, whatever issues I'm having with this medication, just reaching out to people who are coming up on transplant or in transplant help me to hold myself accountable.
I think we're hearing about the power and maybe some of the limitations of the support groups. I want to make sure we also touch upon the monitoring, the reminders, and the automatic things that we're also today. Any, from what you heard about those types of initiatives, any thoughts that resonate? Yeah, that would be great for me. Now I don't, for me, anything of that sort?
I think it sort of maybe goes without saying for some of us. I think most of, and we've made this observation before, the reason that we're all here is because we own our disease and we're invested in making something work. That said, I also think that most of us in the room, and probably those online and those who didn't know about this meeting, etc., they don't want to be reminded we're sick. I mean, we're patients, right? We have our own classification. Right? There's a reason that you guys are holding this meeting for transplant patients, right? No one really wants to be reminded through whatever system, and by taking their medications, I'm sick, I'm not normal, right? And so the more and the faster we can get to some of those transformational changes, I hope, that adherence, eventually the goal of adherence goes away. We don't need adherence, right? Because the need to take a medication isn't there at all. So.
And that's with you're talking about reminders sort of globally, no matter how they come at you. Okay.
Dr., we were talking about earlier about the incentives for adolescents. I was thinking about my son's 16 years old. He would respond to that. So, but I think that, I think again, when you're looking at incentives to promote adherence, I think they're not sustainable. I think it goes back to the fact is that the transplant population as a whole is not really well understood. And where my recommendation is that's where the time should be spent to understand your patients. I don't need to be told what to do. Many times I'll tell my doctor what needs to be done. So I think that's where the shift needs to go. We're not a monolithic group. There's segments. And we get to understand that segment of patients and implement strategies accordingly.
I work in a community of an alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, and many of the people in the community, not a great percentage, but there are several that have had either lung and or liver transplant due to their condition, and the nonprofit organization that I work for is called AlphaNet, which is everybody that works for AlphaNet is somebody with alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. And it was really refreshing today to hear all of these different adherence, different angles to get people to adhere more to their medication regimens and to manage their care well. It was very validating for me because that's exactly the model that we use. We telephone alphas every month. We talk to them about, are you taking your medications? Have you been to your doctor? Have you kept your appointments? Are you exercising? So all of the critical components of compliance we cover. And it seems to have great outcomes with some preliminary in-house studies that we've done in promoting, better quality of life for these people, as well as, increasing their quality of life as well as their longevity. And I know our medical director, Dr. Sandy Sandhouse, I don't know if any of you know him, but his most recent studies have shown that together with that personal touch, with checking in on compliance items with people that have a specific condition, as well as even for those that have been transplanted, those same kinds of questions has really made a difference in their lives. So again, all of the things that you're doing and the presentations that you've made have really helped validate for me personally that we're on the right track.
Great. Jim, I'm going to tie into Jack's comment. I'm going to put the spot. This is the second time now I'm putting the spotlight back on you. Sorry. But what Jim's talking about is a type of reminder. I think this is the mixed intervention approach. You have reminders and support coupled in one because you're calling every time. Take it to what you were talking about monitors or reminders that are coming at you. How would you respond to Jim? With the support aspect of it, does it remind you that you're sick, or does it help you in any way? Do you have any thoughts following up on that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna seem like a hypocrite, but I have an alarm on my phone to help me take my meds, right? But every time that goes off, I'm like, oh yeah, no, most of the population doesn't have to do this. My brother doesn't have to do this, etc. And they're not. It's not that they're not good interventions, right? But and it's not that I haven't recommended them to other patients and techniques that have either worked or not worked for me. But really, I don't know. I sort of want to, just to take it a step forward and think about, how do you minimize the impact on the psyche of the patients, and those reminders in that, it's just more concentration that you have a disease, and if you can, have it minimally invasive within the patient's sort of, routine. Those are going to be sort of the best interventions, and obviously those are going to be individualized. We talk about individualized medicine, so yeah. So not that the techniques or reminders aren't good. It's just.
But coupled with something else, a support or just part of your daily life.
Right, and mom nagging me.
Yeah. We'll go right here, and then we'll go to you.
I think I was just taking everything in that you were saying, but I also think it's very individual. You know what I mean? To be quite frank with you, I have a reminder too. I don't listen to my reminders anymore, right? Because it just goes off. But I don't think I'm sick if my reminder goes off, right? I mean, right. I used to think I was sick because I had so many doctor's appointments. That was my big thing. But that's all individual, right? So for you, it may be something else. For me, it's a different issue. But I really hope technology, and I think that some of the presenters were going there. We're not there yet, right? This electronic pill box, I don't think it's perfected yet quite, but we hope that Apple or someone else comes out with a really, really cool thing, right, where it's so easy that you do it. But I just don't think we're there yet. That's all.
Thanks. Let me turn, Kevin, please.
I had a question. If we had the transplant programs represented here, I wonder if we could ask them the same question. Do they have the right incentives to promote adherence? Do they have the right metrics? I know they have a disincentive. If a graph fails, it impacts their score and their quality measures, but that's driving some behavior. But do they have the right metrics or incentives to promote adherence, to put these kinds of programs in place that we heard about, where people are doing essentially reviews every 3, 6, 9, 12 months?
All right, well then, is this an answer to the question?
It is exactly an answer to the question. There is a disincentive, frankly, in practice to be dealing with adherence for the following reasons. Number one, usually if you're going to address it, you want to be able to do something about it at that time. That means more personnel. The transplant administration is not going to give you that additional personnel. We used to have a psychologist in our clinic. We don't anymore because of budget cutbacks. Number two, there's an issue of time. Given the large volume in a lot of the adult transplant centers, there's not sufficient time for them to be dealing in depth with that. If you have a liver nurse, somebody was mentioning this morning, the liver and the transplant nurse coordinators are the best invention ever. But the fact of the matter is that if they have caseloads of 150, 200 patients, they're not going to be able to spend time or call the patients or whatever. So in fact, adherence monitoring and everything is disincentivized for those reasons.
So in the interest of time, we'll go, yes, please go ahead, and then we'll go with Kevin, and then we'll wrap up the...
So I've been keeping my mouth shut because I'm a transplant physician. I'm Rosman, and I'm a transplant nephrologist and clinical investigator at University of Alabama, Birmingham, and appreciate the opportunity to be here. I just wanted to address the question about adherence because I'm in one of those large adult programs. And I think that we have a limited budget, and we do a lot of transplant, and you think we're making money, but we're a not-for-profit state hospital. And so the issues of immune monitoring are very expensive now, and we have pharmacists as outpatients, but recently our budget was cut, and junior pharmacists on the inpatient squad quit, and we had no inpatient pharmacists, so teaching the pre-discharge all went to nursing staff who are already overburdened. I think we want to do it. What our program has tried to do is focus on high-risk groups. I'm in a pretty diverse socioeconomic, I'm in the Deep South, so we have to focus in the first year, and we have weekly calls with the coordinators, and we try to look at levels, and that's what we use. So it's not that we don't care. I think we are just pushed, and our administrator keeps calling the slot to see patients is like 10 minutes, and dude, that is not going to matter. You know, I ask, like, how you feeling? And that's an open-ended question that may take 15 minutes. I do see the psychosocial stress. I see it in particular on the long-term dialysis patient who has had a routine for 10 years, the same people, the same nurses, and they lose that. All of a sudden they have this transplant and a lot of what they did is gone. They can't get back to work. So there are, I think, a lot of issues. I think that the centers are trying to work on adherence. I don't think most of them do a good job. I don't think we do. And we do look at once-a-day medications and alterations, but I think it also goes back to another unmet need is understanding the sufficiency of immunosuppression for y'all, because it's different from organ to organ, and it's very different from patient to patient.
Thank you. We'll have one more, Kevin, one more comment, and then we'll
Just to support like what Dr. Mannion said and Dr. Ettinger, is that I don't think it's like no one is operating with any bad intentions at all. But I think the truth, and this is beyond the scope of this conversation, is the way the transplant is set up right now, the quality incentives are 1 year. And until that changes to 3 years, you're going to keep having these conversations and over. So strategically, that needs to be a bigger conversation to change that. And then you talk about incentives, then you'll see adherence, education rising. But frankly, until that happens, you're going to have a lot of just symptomatic responses. So, my 2 cents.
All right, so we've had a long day. We didn't get to the issue of forgiving drugs, but I think that hopefully if you're on the expert panel and have perspectives that you can give to the docket, that'd be great. Or if you're an expert out there or have thoughts on this, do it as well. But I think that we have done all we can do in this amount of time. We have 2 open public comment, people who sign up for open public comment. And in fairness, we do this for every meeting, a chance to give people a fora to talk about something that may be a little bit off topic. And so I'm going to, usually we have this script we read, but I'm just going to say the big things. Please keep your comment brief. And if you have anything to disclose, a financial affiliation or relationship that would be useful for us to know, we encourage you to disclose it. You don't have to disclose anything. And we'll just bring the mic to you. So we have 2 people. Debbie Drew, do I have that right? And I'll ask you to keep your comment to 2 minutes or less. Is Debbie here? What? Okay, all right. And how about Mary Pierce? Okay.
I'll try not to take all 4. We started this program by talking about the benefits and the risk of transplant. And I just want to say that with lung transplants, the risk is that we'll only live 54% chance that we'll live for 5 years. The benefit is that we have a 54% chance of living for 5 years. So I work with lung disease. I am an alpha-1 patient. Alpha-1 antitrypsin is a genetic disorder that can cause liver and or lung disease in adults and liver disease in children. In disclosure, I work currently as an advocate for Doman Life Science Services. We're a specialty pharmacy, but I'm here at the request of the Alpha-1 Foundation, and basically to summarize the results of a survey that they did recently. And frankly, most of the results have been covered today with wonderful correlation with what we discovered. We surveyed 81 patients that were a variety, 58 with double lungs, 3 single lungs, 37 liver, and a couple of other various patients. And there were just a few things that we didn't really bring up that were discovered. The question, most significant disadvantages or complications of your current treatments. Of the group, 74% responded that it was about cost and access. And when I was looking at that, I thought, oh my gosh, I don't even know how much my drugs cost. I'm eligible for Medicare. I'm scared of going on Medicare under a company plan. Added up the cost of my medications for 1 month, and they're about $1,500. With the addition of augmentation therapy, which for alpha-1 patients, we take it before transplant, and it's a bit controversial whether we do it post-transplant, but 43% of our people are using it post-transplant. The cost of that drug is $8,000 to $12,000 a month. So we are a little afraid of what's going on with cost and access. We talked about support groups. 96% of our respondents are in a support group, either an alpha-1 or a transplant support group. And I am going to skip over a lot of this.
And I hope, Mary, you submit the full thing to our docket, so we'll have it as well.
Okay.
So submit all of your results.
Good. And then one other question, what's the ideal treatment what would you consider the ideal treatment for transplant? And again, make it less expensive. 71% of the people said that it needs to be less expensive. And then the positive part, how has your condition changed post-transplant? 69% said their condition is better, and 17% there was no change. So those are both positives. 69% had depression. And then finally, we asked whether they would be willing to join a working group to work out the next steps, and 88% of them said yes, they would volunteer. And I guess I'd pose that to the rest of the transplant patients still in here. How willing would we be to participate in a working group from here on forward? And from what we heard recently, it sounds like it's up to us as patient groups to begin to take over some of these issues that providers don't have funding or time to do. So I'll leave you all with that question.
Thank you very much, Mary. I suppose if you reflect on Mary's question, you can contact through the docket or through those mechanisms, through PACE. The slides, by the way, the slides will all be online in a few days, and you will see in there the contact to our professional affairs and stakeholder engagement staff who can address that, or you can come to our team as well if an organization is interested. We'll connect you with that as well. One other thing that came up, both Michelle and I were going to mention this. There was an issue about CMS and their role in here, and we just want to acknowledge that that came up.
And a similar issue that Debbie was going to bring up, who was our heart transplant patient, was her thinking is that maybe some reasons for adherence concerns and issues is related to access in terms of refills with specialty pharmacies and really that frontline staff dealing with trying to get your refills and all the other comorbidities you're dealing with from your transplant and other diseases, the impact of just dealing with sometimes staff and the turnover or the merging or dismerging of pharmacies, so at an access level of drugs. And that was her comment.
And another one that I heard about was the strict timelines of the 30-day supply and the issues that can raise about that. So that was Ellen's comment. We don't have Ellen, do you want to say one small? Okay, we're going to let Ellen do this because she came up to me so nicely.
Well, first of all, I love what the FDA is doing in terms of engaging patients. Let me start with that. The other players in this, one is CMS, the other is Congress. The whole game at the political end is cutting Medicare spending. And that is one of the stresses that CMS works under all the time. But it means, for instance, when you talk about a one-a-day pill or a combination pill, anything having to do with making it easier for patients to comply is also going to raise cost questions. And you will get patients need to engage with CMS in understanding that this isn't just a matter of convenience, that some of these drugs, the fact that you have an easier way for patients to manage their care, it's not just convenience, it is really a matter of improved outcomes.
Great. So lots of topics were discussed today. Again, go to the docket. We really do read all those comments, and we appreciate them. Evaluation forms, please fill them out. There should be some at your table. Please leave the clickers here. They're really not useful outside of this room, and they're not decorative either. So. And with that, am I missing anything I need to say? Okay. Then thank you so much to the panelists. We're going to let Renata give some closing remarks, but I want to thank the panelists and the audience participants for a very engaging discussion. Thank you.
So, thank you, Sarah. Actually, I think there are a lot of groups here today that deserve a round of applause. 3 years ago, Teresa Mullen, who did an introduction this morning, met with our division, and she said, there's this new initiative about involving patients. And we immediately said, oh, we've got a topic. We'd like patients who have solid organ transplant. And she said, well, we can only do 20 topics. And every year when they met, I said, we really want to have a meeting on patients, to talk to patients with solid organ transplants, because in the transplant field, as you've heard from our colleagues here on the right with the scientific perspective, and from industry, and from physicians and nurses and doctors, we know about their involvement, but we said we really want to hear from patients. So it is so gratifying to see that today on the 27th of September, we actually have this patient-focused drug development meeting with patients who have received a solid organ transplant. So I need to say that to everybody that I spoke to during the course of the day, they are just so happy and so excited and so grateful for this opportunity. And I just want to say that we are all so grateful for you taking the time out of your schedules, making the effort to drive, not just locally, but from far, Beltway notwithstanding. And I apologize, you're probably going to run into Beltway traffic. But it has just been such a wonderful day, and we have just heard so much from you and really benefited from it. So I want to thank the patients who spoke in the morning. I want to thank Jim, Jeff, Lila, Michael, and Lindsay for the first panel. Piper, Dan, Debbie, Jack, and Roberta for the second panel, and all of you that have just voiced your opinion, shared your comments, shared your perspectives, and really told us some really important life stories. I think you've identified a lot of issues. FDA is not going to be able to tackle all of them, but I think there are many people in the audience, and there are people who are on the web, and there are people that the transplant community interacts with, and I think many of the messages that you've shared today are going to get repeated to people outside this room, because I think we really, in the area of transplant, have had a lot of stakeholders, and now we also have the patients as part of the dialogue. So this has been very important. Again, thank you very much, and in the interest of not prolonging the day, thank you, and we really appreciate your input today.